Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Welcome to Nashville. No meal this week, and being in Nashville makes that a bummer. We are interviewing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. If you're interested, you don't need a summary from me. You're going to be with us. If you're not interested, no summary from me is going to entice. So without further ado, my interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thanks for spending time with CBS.
Thank you for having me.
Why do you want to be president?
I feel like our country has gone off the rails. That the America that I grew up with is that somehow we've, both political parties, have lost track of what America's supposed to look like, that we're supposed to be a country that is nurturing a middle class rather than Wall Street, that we're a nation of moral authority around the world rather than a nation that leads with war, that we lead with diplomacy, that the people run our government rather than the corporations that have captured it in this corrupt merger of state and corporate power, that our children are the healthiest children in the world today. They're the sickest. 60% of our kids now have chronic disease. When my uncle was president, it was only 6%, and there's no other nation that has anything like that. We're mass poisoning our children with processed foods. We have 1,000 ingredients in our foods that are illegal in Europe. We're destroying our soils, which was, is the basis of our economy, of our history, of our culture. And we have opportunities now in the future that are going to come from technology like AI and blockchain. But those technologies can also be used to destroy democracy, to further degrade the middle class, to allow government to literally warp and distort our reality, or they can be used to make government more transparent and more of a servant to the people. And I think we need leadership that understands that understands the peril and the potential, and that has a very clear idea of what America is supposed to look like. And I don't think we have that from either political party. I think both political parties have now been captured by corporate interests. I think that trend was accelerated and amplified after the Citizens United decision was issued by the Supreme Court in 2010, and it unleashed this tsunami of corporate money into the American political landscapes. This campaign apparently is going to cost about $15 billion to both political parties, and the people who are supplying that money are not doing it out of patriotic impulses. They're doing it because it's an investment from which they expect a return. And because of all that money in the political process, our economic system has become a kind of pump to pump wealth upward away from the strip mine, the equity and wealth from the American middle class, to this new oligarchy of billionaires that is really stealing our democracy from us.
You mentioned the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court historically had been regarded as a bulwark, as an institutional norm setter. Do you regard it that way? Some people have now come to believe the Supreme Court is corrupt.
I would say that
you mentioned a Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's others recently, even more recently than Citizens United, the trouble.
Yeah. I would say that, that the Supreme Court, like the other institutions of our government, is in decline, has become degraded, and Americans no longer have faith in its independence, in its judiciousness. I think that it is dominated by judges who believe that it's okay for corporations that really don't distinguish between what's good for America.
Let me ask you about things just happened. Did you watch the president's address last night?
I watched part of it.
Your impression?
I didn't think that he I think it was more of a statement about what his accomplishments were rather than sort of a reassurance to the American public about where we are today.
Did he provide an adequate explanation of the circumstances of the last week, to your belief?
I don't think so.
What's missing?
Well, you know, I've known Joe Biden for 40 years, and I commend him and respect him for the 50 years that he gave in service to our country. But I think he tarred that reputation and that career over the past year by refusing to let go of power. And, you know, one of the things that a lot of Americans blame Donald Trump for is the January 6th event, which
Do you?
suggested that he was unwilling to let go of power. And let me just finish what I'm saying. You know, one of the most important events in the history of our country was George Washington's decision to resign after the second term. So I think part of our traditions is that our leaders relinquish power, and that they do that graciously. And no, I don't think that President Trump did that graciously, and I don't think President Biden did either.
Do you equate the two morally?
You mean in that sense, or in
January 6th and President Biden waiting until just Sunday to say he was not seeking re-election?
Well, what I would say, Major, is that I think democracy in our country is in an existential crisis. And it's an existential crisis because of the failure of leadership. And the failure has occurred both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And, you know, a lot of Democrats, I feel, focus on what happened on January 6th, which was, you know, there were terrible crimes committed then, and it was an attack, in one sense, on our democracy. But the much worse attacks on our democracy occurred before January 6th and continued afterward, which was the attacks on our Bill of Rights, the censorship, widespread censorship by government of political speech in this country, which has never happened before. When my father took control of the Justice Department in 1961, 1 week after he came to the Justice Department, he called all the division heads and the branch heads and into his big cavernous office of the Justice Department, where I spent a lot of my youth. And he said, the one thing that we all need to understand is there will be no politicization. We never ask whether defendant is Republican or Democrat. We don't punish political opponents. We don't reward political friends. It is critical that the American people believe that these institutions of government, these enforcement institutions, are neutral, that they're blind. And I think both administrations, and President Trump did the same thing. He promised to lock up Hillary Clinton. He said he was going to appoint a special prosecutor.
You are listening to The Takeout Segment 2 with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. coming your way.
I'm going to bring in Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, people from every political party. I want them all represented.
Welcome back to The Takeout, continuing my conversation with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Talk to me about the meeting you had with former President Trump in Milwaukee. Were you in those meetings prepared to end your campaign, endorse former President Trump, and accept a role in his administration?
No. President Trump called me a few hours after the
Was that ever any part of the discussion, those things I just described?
I won't talk about exactly what we discussed because it would be a violation of trust. But we talked about, and by the way, I will talk to anybody. So I think it's important that we start talking to each other. So if President Trump asks me for a meeting, I'm going to go to that meeting. If Kamala or President Biden asked me to a meeting, I spoke at the Libertarian Convention. That's not my party. I will talk to anybody. When my uncle.
But I mean, what happened in Milwaukee?
We talked about how to tone down the rhetoric. We talked about unifying our country and different ways to do that. We talked about public health and that my ambitions to try to protect children's health in this country, particularly. And aside from that, I wouldn't. I'm not.
How did the video emerge of the phone call you had with former President Trump, the speakerphone call? And do you regret that?
Yeah, it's a video that I regret emerged. It was.
Was that a violation of confidence?
Yeah, that was a violation of confidence. And I should never let that happen. There was a videographer when President Trump called me. There was a videographer who was in-house in our campaign who was photographing me then, and he didn't stop, and I should have made him stop. And that was an unforced error.
Can you do a thought experiment for me? Let's say you win. Who's your attorney general?
Oh, I'm not going to talk about that.
Have you given thought to who would be in the top positions of your administration?
Yeah, I have been.
Any suggestion for the American public on who might lead Treasury, who might lead HHS, who might lead the Department of Agriculture, as you just said, is in the pockets of big farms?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to bring people in. First of all, I gave a speech about this, about the kind of people that I'm going to put in those. I gave that speech. It was a unity speech, talking about how President Lincoln brought in a team of rivals, which I'm going to do too. I'm going to bring in Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, people from every political party. I want them all represented there. I want to end the vitriol in this country. I want to end the demonization of each other. I want an administration that every American can look at and say, my views are represented in cabinet meetings. My views are being heard, and I want people to understand that and have faith in that. And I want.
But that's as specific as you're going to
name
get.
People who are not captured by the industries that they're regulating, who are independent and who are committed to public health, public welfare, to the environment, et cetera.
Is your campaign right now closer than it's ever been to being over?
To being over? No, my campaign, it will be over on Election Day.
There's no circumstance in which you drop out of this race?
No.
And endorse anyone?
I can't imagine a circumstance right now where I would do that. I mean, anything is possible, but I can't. At this point, there is nothing in the cards.
Are you disappointed that ballot access has been as slow and possibly frustrating as it's been?
Yeah. I mean, it would be much easier for me if we were automatically on the ballot, or if there was some reasonable threshold for getting us on the ballot. The ballot access rules were written by the Democrats and Republicans, and they were written in a way that was deliberately intended to make an independent candidacy like mine insurmountable. And we've been able to overcome that. I'm the first presidential campaign in history that's been able to overcome that. I've gotten more ballot signatures than any presidential candidate in history.
More than Ross Perot?
No, well, see, he didn't have this kind of threshold. When Ross Perot ran, it was very easy to get on the ballot. But today they learned their lesson then, and they made it much more difficult. So. And each state has different rules. They're all designed to make it nearly impossible. But I now have enough signatures to get on the ballot in every state. So I will be
awaiting certification in many of them.
Awaiting certification, but that's not our issue. The states.
How do you evaluate this race now that
the states won't issue certification until, many of them to the end of August, the beginning of September.
How do you evaluate the race now that President Biden has stepped aside and it appears Democrats are very enthusiastically rallying around Kamala Harris, the vice president?
Do you think
the race has shifted?
Yeah, I mean, the level of enthusiasm for my campaign has increased dramatically. Our volunteers.
Since when?
Since President Biden's resignation and the announcement of Vice President Harris as his replacement. So our volunteer engagement is up. We already have 100,000 volunteers, and we are getting more every day. We got many, many more than any other campaign. Our email subscriptions are dramatically up. Our visits to our homepage are up 1,000%, and we're getting similar engagement on YouTube, on X, on TikTok. Our contributions are up. And you know, I'm told that the biggest song on iTunes this month is Bobby Kennedy for President, and that's all happening since President Biden's withdrawal.
So help me understand. Politico wrote this week that your campaign is $3 million in debt, that you've canceled a raft of events, that you haven't had a public campaign rally type event since May 19th. Does that sound like a campaign that's surging to you?
Well, you can't believe everything that you read in Politico.
That's all false, in other words.
Not all that is false. We did cancel. We have not done the kind of rallies that we were doing previously because of the expense of them. Listen, Major, we had to do things that no other campaign has to do. I had to pay for my own security, and the $3 million that we owe is related to my security expenses. Everybody else got Secret Service protection. I'm the first candidate since my father died that has requested Secret Service protection and to whom it's been denied. There's 35 candidates who've gotten it who, before the 120-day cutoff, who had polling that was far less than mine. So we also have to do ballot access. Nobody else has to do that. We had to get millions of ballots in every state across the country. And that's a $15 million expense. My campaign is only allowed to raise $6,600 per person. The Biden and Trump campaign get to raise $750,000 per person. So they've written rules to make it nearly impossible for anybody like me to run. And what I think journalists ought to be asking is not, why are we, number one, why are we still alive with all of those, headwinds against us? And shouldn't we be patted on the back for that? Why is this happening in our country? I grew up in a Democratic Party that was fighting to make sure that everybody who voted got to vote. Every American got to vote for whoever they wanted to vote for, to make sure everybody could vote. We now have a Democratic Party that's spending millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars to challenge my ballot access in every state, to wage a lawfare, a war against me, to impose costs on me that no other candidate has to pay.
From whom?
So of course we're struggling for money, but we're getting the money and our campaign is viable. And look, because of my security issues, each rally that we did was costing us about $200,000 to pay for the security. Because of the kind of thing that you saw happen to President Trump, we had to pay for all that Secret Service protection. So, we had to focus on ballot access for a while. We've now completed ballot access, and we're back running the campaign again like we would have been.
Great to have you with us here at The Takeout. When we come back, more of my conversation with Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
I felt I could do anything with my willpower, but somehow this compulsion was impervious to it.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Welcome back to Nashville. Continuing our conversation with Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. From whom do you believe you will draw more votes, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump?
Well, I hope to draw votes from both of them. Right now, I draw many more votes from President Trump than from
Is he happy with that?
What?
Is he happy with that?
is President Trump happy? He isn't happy. And in fact, the RNC, I told him that when I saw him. And he was like, yeah, we got to do something about that. And the DNC has been much more aggressive against me. And, in opposition research, they've committed, millions and millions of dollars to thwart me from getting ballot access and then to destroy me reputationally. And the RNC has not been that bad, but we're starting to see the RNC.
Do you expect to see that coming?
We're seeing it now. So, in fact, people contacted me last night because they're contacting people I haven't seen for 40 years. Every friend that I've ever met, every woman that I've ever dated is being contacted. Oh, and it was mainly the DNC. But I learned last night that now there's a wave of RNC contacts as well. So
let's talk a little bit about the history. 2012, the New York Times wrote about this. There was a deposition in which you described an abnormality in brain scans as, quote, caused by a worm that got into my brain and ate a portion of it and then died. Do you stand by that deposition?
Well, the deposition says what the deposition says, which is that and that was a medical condition that I had at that time. I'm not sure what your question is.
Well, for those who hear that and have some concern, what would you tell them to allay concerns hearing what I just read?
I'm happy to take a cognitive test, and I'm happy to debate any other candidate. I go on podcasts, hour-long podcasts, longer than this show every day, and that is a cognitive challenge that most people would maybe have a hard time with. So nobody's ever challenged my cognitive. Back then I was having brain fog, which happens to a lot of people. It turned out that was not the issue with my brain fog. It was I had metal toxicity, which I then had chelated out. And I've never had any of those issues.
The mercury.
Yeah.
So this was the deposition, but that's not what the actual condition was.
No, but
the mercury.
I learned that. At that time, I didn't know what the issue
understood.
was.
That's what I wanted to ask.
And I learned in the course of trying to figure out, why I was having brain fog. I did a brain scan, and they found something that looked like a tumor, and it turned out not to be a tumor, and I was told it was a parasite. I've learned because of this controversy, because the New York Times found that deposition, aired it as if it was breaking news, and then there was a lot of publicity that followed, but I learned during that time that there's 1.6 billion people who have that same parasite, so it's very, very common.
You also have atrial fibrillation, 4 episodes that led to hospitalization, according to the records I've reviewed. How well are you, and what is the state of that condition?
I haven't had an incident of atrial fibrillation. They call it athlete's heart. And I got it when I was playing rugby and rowing crew at college. And it's never been the kind of atrial fibrillation I have is really benign because my heart doesn't speed up. It just goes out of sync and then it goes back in sync. So, and I haven't had it in close to a decade.
Your use of heroin and other drugs earlier in your life and the addiction that arose from that, how has that shaped you in your current?
I think my experience with addiction, I've been in recovery for 40 years. My experience with addiction and recovery has been, I think, so important to my life, to my, I'd say, spiritual growth, spiritual and emotional growth, that, I often say honestly that I'm grateful that I got that disease because of the struggle in overcoming addiction, and the gift that I've gotten in recovery has been probably the biggest gift in my life. And I'm very, very active in recovery. It's part of my daily life and and it's provided me discipline. It's provided me a path to understanding, to a commitment to character that I think that I otherwise would have been much less focused.
A couple of times you've made reference to the country you grew up in. As you well know, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the country you grew up in would have said a heroin addict is disqualified automatically from ever becoming president of the United States.
Well, when my uncle ran for president, Major, being a Roman Catholic was a disqualification from holding the White House. So we all end up making our own rules about certain things.
But I want to get at that thing that you learned and why you would tell someone, hey, don't hold addiction against someone seeking higher office, because there's something of value that can be found there. I think I heard you say something like that.
I don't know. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but for me, addiction, I believe that I was born with the disease. In other words, that empty hole inside of me existed before I found heroin or any drug. And that was a treatment for something I already had. And I believe that I was self-medicating during that 14 years that I was an active addict. And, I had iron willpower, even when during that period I gave up candy for Lent when I was 13. I never had candy again until I was in college. I gave up desserts the following year and never had another dessert till I was in college and trying to bulk up for sports. And I felt I could do anything with my willpower, but somehow this compulsion was impervious to it. And addiction is a spiritual malady. And the remedy for addiction is a spiritual commitment. And, I had to choose at one point between basically dying or embracing a new set of values. And I think that process of committing myself to those values, the values that keep me sober, and a connection to God, is what saved my life. And you can't live off the laurels of a spiritual awakening. You have to renew it every day. And what my program teaches me is that the only way that I can stay sober is by being of daily service to other people. And I think that's an important lesson, not only for addicts, but it's an important lesson for all of us who are trying to learn to live in communities that are not based upon selfishness, and to live in communities that we can be proud of.
Great to have you with us here at The Takeout. When we come back, more of this conversation.
I've never been anti-vaccine. I've said that for 20 years. That's a pejorative.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Welcome back to Nashville. Again, our conversation with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. How much does it trouble you that so many members of your extended family oppose this run for the presidency and give quotes to say that you have a, quote, savior complex or a pathological need for attention?
I have a very big family. And I think there's 105 members of my family. I have family members who are working on the campaign, who are running big parts of my campaign. I have family members who are managing the campaign, who are running entire states, who are running other programs for it. I don't know anybody in this country who has a family my size in which they have a unanimity of opinion about anything. But also,
those quotes have to hurt.
And let me finish what I'm saying. I come from a family, from a gestalt where we were encouraged from when we were little kids to debate each other. Every night at the dinner table, my father would orchestrate debates, political debates, and he would get us to take sides, to argue passionately those sides, and and fiercely, but not to hate each other in the process. It's to still be able to love each other. I love my family. I feel loved by my family. And so I don't let those kind of remarks bother me. And I think, Major, that is something that I wish for my country, that we could debate each other, we could differ with each other on opinions, and without hating each other. If Kamala called me and said, I want to talk to you about unifying our country, I would be there in a second. There's nobody in the Democratic Party who's ever called me in the last 18 months. I've reached out to them many times. And if President Trump wants to talk to me, I'll talk to him every day. I think that's important for our country.
What does a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. administration do about immigration today?
My policy on immigration is really clear, which is we need secure borders. We shouldn't have the Sinaloan drug cartel dictating America's immigration policy. We should not be allowing, we shouldn't have pervious borders. There's no country in the world that allows that, and we shouldn't allow it here. It's bad for our country. I differ with President Trump about immigration in general. What my policy is high walls but wide gates, that we need workers in this country. We need to keep Social Security solvent. We need to, one of the big economic impediments in our country now is that small businesses cannot get workers. We need to make it easier for workers to come into our country. We need a quicker path to citizenship, but we need to put we need the U.S. government in charge of that and not a drug cartel. So, and that the people who wait in line should be the people who come into our country. We need to shorten that line, make it faster, make it easier for them to get citizenship. But an open border is not the solution.
Vanity Fair described you as an anti-vax crank. Are you?
I've never been anti-vaccine. I've said that for 20 years. That's a pejorative that is applied to me in order to silence the legitimate criticism, the legitimate questions I have about vaccine safety and efficacy. There are certain people, vaccines, like every other medication, cause injuries. And there's a manufacturer's insert in each vaccine, and those list the 72 vaccines now required for American children, list about 420 separate injuries, and including death, and all kinds of neurological and autoimmune injuries. But if somebody comes to you, Major, and says, I got a vaccine injury, you are not gonna let them on TV. You're gonna, the goal of the press is to gaslight them, is to say it doesn't exist, to protect the program. I don't think that's right. I think even if they're rare, that, my issue is we should be studying these children that are injured. We should be helping them the same as a kid who gets a rare cancer. We can't shut them aside. If they got a mandated medical intervention and they got sick from it, we should be taking care of them, and we don't. We throw them on a dust heap. And if somebody is satisfied with the vaccine program and they want their vaccines, there's nothing in my administration that's going to interfere with them getting it.
The Vanity Fair article raised the name of Eliza Cooney, a part-time babysitter for you. You sent her a text apologizing. What did you apologize for, and what happened?
My statement speaks for itself to her. It was a private address to her. I have no memory of any of this incident that she describes in it, and it's something that doesn't sound in character for me. But human interactions are complicated. People have different interpretations of them, and if I did anything to hurt somebody, I'm going to make amends for that. And that was my purpose in sending that note. I didn't intend that note to be public. I make no comment on her allegations publicly. But, I don't want to leave anybody in the world feeling like I did something that was insensitive or inappropriate and not make an amends to them.
Do you think you may have to do that ever again?
It's quite possible. I'm 70 years old. I had a very rambunctious life. I have right now I'm having hundreds of interactions with people all the time. I've had a very, very active life, and it's quite possible that I've left people who feel injured or who feel injured from me in some way. And if that happens, I'll apologize to them as well.
Very last question. Anything you want to say about the picture with the dog from 2010?
The picture with?
The dog on the spit.
Oh.
And the allegation that you ate dog or suggested people do so.
Yeah. Well, I've never eaten a dog. And,
Is that unfair?
I think the Vanity Fair article was a collection of, as most of the mainstream media, most of the stories I would say about me in the mainstream media are mischaracterizations. Everything about my attitudes towards vaccines, for example, towards science. And I'm not complaining because that's what you get when you try to break into an ossified system. You're going to get a lot of response, and the Vanity Fair article is a collection of, I would say, of untrue defamations, and one of those is that I ate a dog in Korea. I've never. They say that. The animal that I was eating at that time was that they had a veterinarian identify it as a dog, that they've had meta-analysis to show that I was in Korea. All of that is untrue. I go to Patagonia every year, and for much of my adult life to kayak a whitewater river down there called the Futalaifu. And on that river, we eat lambs and goats at night, and that's what I was eating at that time. But I think Vanity Fair felt that it would be better for their narrative to say that I was eating a dog. So, there are many eyewitnesses who were with me in Chile at that time and who have testified to that. But I guess you didn't get that note.
That's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed this lengthy conversation with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We will see you next week. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial.
I think people need to be reminded of, what our country is supposed to look like and what, our potential is.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial from Nashville, where we interview Robert F. Kennedy Jr. When your dad ran in '68, Vietnam was the overwhelming, overarching issue for the country and its future. Is there a Vietnam-type issue today?
I mean, this campaign is so much, Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And this rhymes with 1968. And, particularly for me, because I'm running against, like my dad, against a president of my own political party, against a war. We have a situation where the president then drops out, like when my dad ran. The DNC chooses the successor. The convention is in Chicago. There's a ready-made riot already outside, which you saw in Washington yesterday. So the whole thing has so much echoes of that year. And, that year was the beginning of a downward decline for our country that ended, with Nixon getting elected and then Watergate and Vietnam and 9/11 and, Iran-Contra and Guantanamo and all this, kind of dark trajectory that you can mark that year as the fork in the road, that away from the optimism of the Camelot era towards this very kind of dystopian view that world that we live in today, where America has lost its moral authority, where kids have lost hope and faith in our country. What I hope to do with my candidacy is to reclaim those,
Get back to that time before the fork in 1968.
Before the military-industrial complex, which is what Eisenhower predicted. Before they took over. And, my voice, I think, is really important because I think people need to be reminded of, what our country is supposed to look like and what, our potential is. And that we can, like I said, a lot of this is driven by the division, like it was in '68, where you had the greatest polarization since the Civil War.
Without doubt.
Right? And we're now back to that, with this. And it's all amplified by social media algorithms that reward you for only looking at information that fortifies your worldview. So it's just digging this chasm bigger and bigger between Americans, and the anger and the vitriol and the demonization are getting worse and worse. And, it's hard. If somebody like me doesn't come along who is willing to take the flak by reaching out to both sides, it's hard to see where that's going to have a good end. Because, if you talk to a Republican or a Democrat, they say that, the division is terrible in this country, but then they feed into it. And they get mad at you if you meet with Trump or if you meet with Kamala. So, nobody's willing to do anything about it. And I think, the country needs somebody like me who is actually saying, okay, I'm going to take the heat, the missiles, the arrows from trying to build a bridge to both sides. And, and do it without compromising my basic values, which are liberal Democrat. I feel like I'm the last liberal left standing because I believe in free speech. I'm anti-war. I'm
Classical liberal.
What? I'm the last liberal.
No, classical liberal.
Yeah, the classical Kennedy Democrat.
That's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed the show. Be with us next week.